Alireza Firouza sacrificing the queen against Hikaru Nakamura in game number 1 of the Chess.com Speed Chess Championship semifinals. Are you kidding me? Alright, it is that time. It is game number 1 of the Speed Chess Championship semifinals. Hikaru Nakamura opens 1d4 and his opponent Alireza Firouza responds knight f6. And from here, Alireza actually goes for a King's Indian defense with the move g6. Now Hikaru throws a curveball, plays the move f3. The idea here, of course, is to support the center with immediate e4 break in the center. Now black, bishop g7, white goes e4, black goes d6, standard King's Indian move stopping e5 from white. And now here, white goes knight to c3 and black castles. We have the classical Saemisch King's Indian structure. Now here has a few different choices. The main ideas are knight to e2, bishop e3, and the final option, which Hikaru actually went for in the game, that is bishop g5. Hikaru throwing a little bit of a curveball with this move here. The idea of that move is to pressure the knight on f6. However, beyond that, white's also going to go for a fast queen to d2 with the idea of bishop h6, trying to trade off black's very important dark squared bishop. So what is black going to do about it? In the game here, black responds c5, the Benoni move, probably the best move in the position for black. The idea is you're forcing d5 from white. d5 is the best move if white was to fight for an opening edge. And then the key move for black is going to be e6. We're going to see that in one moment. Here black goes a6, threatening b5 in one move. Of course, white is always going to respond with the move a2 to a4 in response. That is what Hikaru does here. And then finally the move e6 from black. This is the key move in the Modern Benoni, and this is how black gets all of his counterplay. Now here, of course, white has that beautiful pawn structure in the center. Very strong pawns on the c4, d5, e4, and f3 squares. Now this may look impressive, however that pawn on the f3 square does hurt white's development. Of course, knight to f3 is not possible here. Because of that, white's going to have to develop with something like knight to h3 or knight to e2, then g3, and then finally going bishop e2. So this pawn structure does slow down his development. Meanwhile, black, on the other hand, is going to have ways to get counterplay against the center. For example, we could see rook to e8, knight d7 to e5, maybe even ideas like h6 trying to knock the bishop back, then even h5 and h4 gaining space on the king side. So white here, his goal is to stabilize that pawn center, and black's goal is to get counterplay. Now from here, Hikaru develops queen d2. Of course, this is a standard idea in this line with bishop g5. Now we have ideas like bishop h6 on the table, and of course this move does temporarily stop black's idea of h6, which would knock that bishop back to the e3 square. So that is a very important detail. Now here black takes on d5. Of course, white is going to recapture with the c-pawn. Here, recapturing with the e-pawn, e takes d5 is simply suicide, because in this structure, you need to have that pawn on the f2 square. That way you can go knight to f3, bishop d3, and castle very quickly. So with that in mind, c takes d5 is the move. And here already on move 10, black has a very critical decision to make. Now in the game, the best move is actually h6, trying to knock that bishop back to the e3 square. And you may be wondering, doesn't white have that h6 square covered with both the bishop and the queen? Well, it turns out black can play it anyway due to a very beautiful tactical shot. Here's the idea. Black goes h6. If white takes on the h6 square, then the move from black is going to be knight takes e4. The idea is you follow up with queen to h4, winning back the bishop, and then you damage white's pawn structure in the process. So overall, h6, the best idea here. However, Alireza Firouza is thrown off guard. He goes knight b to d7. This is a very typical move in the King's Indian in this sort of Benoni style structure. However, there is one serious drawback of this move. That knight on the g1 square has not moved yet, and now that bishop on c8 no longer controls the h3 square. So with that in mind, Hikaru takes the opportunity to jump in with the knight to h3, intending knight to f2. Next, the bishop simply goes to e2, and from there he can castle on the king's side, and white's development problems are suddenly disappearing thanks to this careless move knight d7 from black. Now here, Alireza Firouza responds queen to a5, activating the queen on this diagonal. Very good idea. Of course, white needs to keep those queens on the board to make best use of his powerful pawn center. So now that knight is effectively pinned to the queen on the d2 square. Now from here, Hikaru Nakamura shows a very creative idea. Rook to a3, activating the rook on the third rank and offering extra protection for the knight. knight. That's very important because black could play ideas like knight to h5, opening up that bishop's access to the knight on c3. So having that knight over defended is never a bad idea for white. Now here black continues knight to e5, very good move, getting the knight into the game. The knight now has access to the c4 square. That's very important in many lines, and he can potentially go c4, trying to gain space on the queen side. And not to mention that bishop on c8 is now attacking the knight on the h3 square. So if white is not careful, then the move bishop takes h3 is coming. With that in mind, Hikaru Nakamura responds knight to f2, continuing his development. And here, Alireza Firouza increases the pressure on the queen side with the move queen to b4. The queen now attacking the b2 pawn. Knight c4 ideas are possible. Of course, that would fork both the queen and the rook. So overall, Alireza Firouza finding a way to get some activity here. Now white, what is he going to do? Well, the best idea is actually to move the queen somewhere, say c2 or c1, and then drop the bishop back to the d2 square. At that point, the bishop stops the pin of the queen on the knight to the king, and from there you are threatening all sorts of discovered attacks. For example, if you have a bishop on d2, then you're threatening potentially knight b5 in some lines, trying to target the pawn on the d6 square. And fortunately, Hikaru does find the idea. He goes queen c2 in the game, intending bishop d2 next. Very solid idea. Now, Alireza Firouza, bishop d7, activating the bishop now eyeing the critical a4 pawn. And beyond that, there are ideas like rook c8 that are now possible. Now here, Hikaru continues bishop d2, and here the best move for black is going to be c4, gaining more space on the queen side, and from there he's all sorts of different ideas. However, instead of that, here Alireza Firouza, knight c4 is the move. And yes, we're leading up to that queen sacrifice I just teased. Here, Hikaru Nakamura finds the best idea. He can simply pressure that queen on the b4 square with the move rook to b3. Now here, what is the queen supposed to do? If you respond queen to a5, then again, you have all sorts of discovered attacks from the knight. For example, knight b5 is possible. That knight would be defended by the pawn on the b5 square. So for example, real fast, queen a5, then knight b5 is possible, targeting the d6 square, and so on. So instead of that, here Alireza Firouza responds with the move knight takes d2. And this means he leaves his queen on the b4 square undefended, and Hikaru takes the queen. Alireza Firouza in game number 1 of the Speed Chess Championships semifinals against Hikaru Nakamura, the madman sacrifices the queen. Easy, I thought Hans Nino was going to be the one to shock the entire chess world. It turns out it's Alireza Firouza up first in game number 1 here. Alright, of course, black responds taking the rook on b4, then white takes the knight, and then finally black takes that knight on the c3 square. Now we have a couple more exchanges here. White takes the pawn on c3, b takes c3 is played, and of course that pawn on the a4 square is hanging. Bishop takes a4 is the move. Now here finally the dust has settled. What's the material balance? Well, white is up an entire queen. Meanwhile, black is up a minor piece, that extra bishop, and an extra rook. Now, if my math is correct, white is up material. The rook and the bishop worth about 8 pawns, whereas the queen worth about 9 pawns. However, black does have that pass pawn on the a6 square supported by the rook, and that means black is threatening simply pushing the pawn down the board all the way to the a1 square and trying to promote. And don't forget, black is already castled here, whereas white still has at least 2 moves, bishop e2, then short castles to get his king to safety. So all this to say, white is up a little bit of material, but black's pawn on the a6 square is very dangerous, and black has very dangerous counterplay. Now here, it's imperative that white simply develops and then castles as quickly as possible. However, instead, Hikaru goes c4, getting more space on the queen side and activating the queen a little bit more on this diagonal. Well, it turns out this is a mistake, and after knight d7, black is already fighting for the initiative. Now white goes queen b4, targeting both the b7 and the d6 pawns. And here, Alireza Firouza plays a very logical response, knight to c5. Of course, this stops the attack on the d6 pawn and threatens b7. However, this is a critical mistake, and here Alireza Firouza missed the key move. That is the move b5. This looks insane, but it works out. Here's the idea. You give up that pawn on the d6 square. However, in return, you insert the check bishop to c3. You're now hitting the king on the e1 square, forcing king to e2. Of course, that other bishop controlled d1. And now look at white's development. The bishop on f1 trapped by the king, the rook on h1 also trapped, the knight on f2 not doing much. And here, after simply b takes c4, the knight on d7 is now defended by the bishop. You now have 2 passed pawns on the queen side instead of 1. And here, Alireza Firouza would have fantastic winning chances. Okay, rewinding just a little bit. Instead of the move b5, knight c5 is played, once again defending b7 and blocking the queen's access to d6. Now Hikaru just goes into beast mode. He starts knight d3, developing his knight, trying to trade off some pieces. If black takes on d3, white recaptures with the bishop. That would be excellent for white. With that in mind, Alireza Firouza responds a5, trying to give that queen a little bit of a tickle on the queen side. Now white's response is queen a3, black goes bishop to d7, simply retreating that bishop back to the d7 square. And now knight takes c5, d takes c5, and bishop e2 for Hikaru. Again, his plan has to be castles as quickly as possible. Now here, Alireza plays a very logical move, rook f to b8. The idea is you're preparing b5 ideas. You simply have to get those pawns on the queen side rolling as fast as possible. Now white, king to f2, a creative way to artificially castle instead of going short castles on the king side. Of course, Alireza is not amused. He goes bishop d4, giving the king a check. The king jumps out to the g3 square, and here we see Alireza's idea, b5 expanding on the queen side. This is a great idea. He simply has to get those pawns rolling. Now Hikaru takes on b5. Black takes back with the bishop, offering yet another trade of minor pieces. And keep in mind, the more minor pieces come off, the more important Hikaru's material advantage becomes. First of all, he's just up material. That's going to benefit him the more trades we have. But second of all, he has the queen, and the queen does best on an open position where it can zig and zag all over the place. And the more pieces that come off, the better that queen is going to be. Now, this is what happens. Hikaru takes on b5, rook takes b5, now queen to a4, threatening the rook on the b5 square. From here, Alireza defends the rook by advancing, rook to b4, of course also threatening the queen on the a4 square. Now Hikaru jumps in with the queen to the c6 square, and all of a sudden we almost have a race with the pawns. Hikaru almost cannot stop the pawns from advancing here. However, on the same time, he has this pawn on the d5 square, and that pawn is now threatening to promote. It's almost like a base trade if you're a StarCraft 2 fan like I was in college. Alright, here black, rook a to b8, activating the rook on the b file. Now Hikaru, rook to e1, and here Alireza needs to advance that a pawn down the queen side as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, he misses the idea. He retreats the rook back to the 6th rank, and this is a critical mistake. It gives up control of that a4 square. And here Hikaru jumps into a4 with the queen to a4, blocking a5 to a4 from black. And now Hikaru has ideas based on e5 and then d6, simply advancing this pawn. Alright, from here black, bishop c3, threatening the rook on the e1 square. Now rook e2 defending, and rook b4 from black. This is a good idea, but it's a little bit too little too late. If you're going to go rook b4, why wouldn't you just leave the rook on b4, then go a4? Of course, Alireza is in severe time pressure here. It's understandable he would make this mistake, but it is a mistake nonetheless. Now, queen c6 from Hikaru, again reactivating the queen and setting up d6 ideas. Alright, now Alireza Firouza trying to counterplay against the white king. He jumps the bishop back to the e5 square, checking the king, hoping white will play a move like f4, at which point white's king position will be more and more vulnerable. But instead of that, here Hikaru goes king to h3, an excellent move. Now, because black doesn't have a light squared bishop, and because these rooks are all the way over on the b file, that king is actually surprisingly safe on the h3 square. Now Alireza finally gets those pawns rolling, c4 on the board, white goes g3, giving the king a little bit more loft on the g2 square, and then c3 from black. Black's pawns are now cruising down the board. Okay, now we see another idea of that g3 move from white, f4 on the board, trying to knock that bishop back. And it may look like black has to move the bishop immediately, but instead, black inserts the intermezzo move, rook to b2, threatening the rook on the e2 square. And of course, here, taking the rook from white as white is not possible. If white goes rook takes b2, then c takes b2, and there is literally nothing white can do to stop the idea b1, getting that queen back that he sacrificed earlier in this game. Now heading back, instead of rook takes b2, obviously Hikaru doesn't make that mistake. Instead, rook to e1 on the board, trying to keep the rook alive, and now bishop d4 from black, infiltrating with the bishop. However, Hikaru's not amused. d6 is his response, and now he's threatening d7, followed by queen to c8, and then d8, forcing through a promotion, and it looks like there's very little that black can do to stop it. Okay, here Firouzja c2 on the board. White goes d7, both sides with these competing passed pawns. Now rook b1 from Alireza Firouza, and here Hikaru plays an absolutely clutch move. He simply picks up that pawn on the c2 square. Queen takes c2 on the board. Of course, the drawback of this move is you simply leave the rook on the e1 square hanging. Rook takes e1 is played, and here black is temporarily up an entire minor piece, the rook's being worth about as much as the queen. However, of course, that pawn on the d7 square is Hikaru's trump card, and here the move queen to c8 secures his material advantage. Now if black takes on c8, obviously Hikaru gets a new queen in response, and that's what happens. Now king to g7, and after all this, Hikaru still has the queen, and Alireza Firouza still has the bishop and the rook and the outside pass pawn. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Now Hikaru e5 on the board. Hikaru is simply trying to block off that bishop with the communication with the king side, making it more difficult for black to defend, but he's also threatening e6 in certain lines. Now Alireza Firouza rook to e2. This is a dangerous move. The idea potentially is going to be bishop to g3, targeting that pawn on the h2 square, and there's going to be very little white can do to stop rook takes h2 in the future, giving the king a check. Now Hikaru queen to c4, threatening the rook on the e2 square, and Alireza Firouza rook d2, defending the bishop on d4. Of course, it was being attacked. Now Hikaru queen c7, simply biding his time. Black goes bishop g1. This was the idea, but here Hikaru spots an essential tactic. He sees that pawn on f7 is currently pinned to the king. It is not legally allowed to move, as that would expose the king. With that in mind, he jumps forward with the e pawn. e6 on the board. And now, of course, f takes e6 not possible, and Hikaru is threatening queen takes f7. What is black gonna do to defend that? Well, it turns out his only chance is to counterattack. He starts by taking the pawn on the h2 square. Rook takes h2. Of course, the king is in check. The king must move king g4 on the board, but now black h5 check, once again hitting the king. Now the king's got to move again, king to g5. And here black is essentially out of checks. The bishop, the rook cannot give a check, and of course f6 not possible as that pawn is pinned to the king. Now black puts all his hopes in the a pawn, a4 on the board. However, this is too little too late. Here Hikaru crashes through with the move queen takes f7, and in this position Alireza Firouza resigns on the spot, and here's why. The only move is king to h8. Of course h6 was covered by the white king, and then white goes king to h6, and no matter what black does, the next move is going to be queen g7 checkmate, and black is checkmated. Wow, what a game. Alireza Firouza with the cojones to sacrifice the queen against Hikaru in game number 1 of the Speed Chess Championship semifinals. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and like this video, leave a comment, let me know what your thoughts are below, and stay tuned for my other analysis covering the very best games of these semifinal matches between Hikaru and Alireza Firouza and Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen, and I'll see you in the next video.